As the government pushes for a return to the office, we look into how much say workers have on where they work. This is Coronavirus, the latest from the Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis. Go back to the office or risk being fired. The government's tough new messaging revealed in Friday's Telegraph. It's part of a major drive by the Prime Minister to get Britain back to work, and you're unlikely to miss it. The government will soon unveil a publicity campaign to promote a return to the workplace. It comes as business leaders warn of the economic damage being done as people stay at home, with footfall in city centres collapsing to just 17% of pre-lockdown levels. The drive will highlight the benefits of mixing with colleagues, reassure employees that workplaces are safe, and help them to avoid crowded trains and buses. And to push the point further, ministers have sent out the message that bosses at struggling firms will find it easier to sack people they never see than colleagues who've been at their desks during the pandemic. Well, 2/3 of Britons still aren't commuting further than their own kitchen tables. But as the UK confirms its highest number of cases since mid-June, with over 1,500 recorded on Thursday, how much of a say do bosses really have on whether their employees show up or buckle down at home? Well, to discuss the rights of employers, employees and the government, I spoke to Melanie Morton. She's a senior associate and solicitor specialising in employment law at the firm Nelson's. Melanie, this government messaging of go back to the office or risk being fired. Now, the government isn't saying that people would be fired directly because they're staying at home, but they're saying that it could be easier for bosses to prioritise those who have made the effort to come in. If an employee feels that they've been fired based on their decision to work from home, is that legitimate grounds for appeal?
I think this really comes down to whether or not the employer is going to allow home working on an ongoing basis because they see the benefits in continuing that themselves. In a situation where an employer permits some degree of home working moving forward, they're not likely, in my view, to target those who decide to take that option. That is different to a situation where employees are being difficult about returning to work for non-legitimate reasons. In that situation, one could see how they might become a bit of an easy target or be accused of not being committed to the company or seen as a team player. But notwithstanding that, if employers are going to make redundancies, in the usual way, they would need to follow a fair procedure and adopt a fair selection process. Using home working as a preference, as a selection criteria in itself and scoring someone down on that basis wouldn't be fair or objective in my view. And of course, if somebody's dismissed on that basis, usually they'd have an internal right to appeal. And if that wasn't successful, they might choose to ask an employment tribunal to look at that.
Have you seen an uptake in people seeking advice on this?
It's really interesting. Yes, from the employers we have, not so much yet from the employees, because I think the majority of people haven't been asked to return yet. We have seen a lot of it, and we are seeing an increase in people sort of moving back, but there is still a huge amount of people who are still at home waiting for their employer's next move. And I do anticipate in the next few weeks and coming months, yes, there will be increase in questions surrounding this topic for sure.
I suspect you're not wrong there. Now, there are going to be some people who feel perfectly safe going back to the office, maybe even looking forward to it. They've been working from home not as effectively, or their home environment isn't conducive to an 8-hour day. And indeed, ministers have been sent out across the airwaves on Friday morning to tell us that offices are COVID secure, notably Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister, on LBC.
It is now safe to start returning. That's what we're encouraging people to do, because although you can do an awful lot of things via video and Zoom and all the rest of it, there are limitations to that, and there'll be times when that's not appropriate.
But there will be other people, perhaps people who feel more vulnerable to the risks of the virus, who still feel that they can't go back to work at all. Is concern about your health, is that enough of a reason to disobey an employer who does demand a return to the office?
I think most employers, hopefully, will communicate with their staff and address any concerns that people have got about health issues, and that those issues need to be raised and addressed on an individual basis. Those who've been shielding or are vulnerable, have got existing illnesses, may well have very legitimate concerns and anxieties about the practicalities of returning. Employers need to acknowledge that and work with those staff to assure them about the safety of their return. It's quite a broad issue because it encompasses not just the physically being in the office and around people, but obviously it concerns about public transport and actually getting to the workplace. I think if an employer is not supportive or is unable to demonstrate that they've carried out the necessary risk assessments or made the adjustments to the workplace in line with the government guidance, and an employee has genuine health and safety concerns regarding that and has raised them and has had no luck in getting them resolved, a refusal to return to work in those specific circumstances might be reasonable.
And do you envisage that employees would have to provide proof that they are, say, more vulnerable to the virus, or that their word would be enough?
That's a really interesting question. I think some people might not take very kindly to having, for being asked for proof. But I think in some circumstances, is an employer reasonable in asking for it? If they've got no prior knowledge of an employee's illness, and this isn't something that's been raised before and it's come as a surprise to the employer, then they might be reasonable in requesting that. I mean, if someone's extremely vulnerable, but they can continue to work at home practically, and they're not strictly needed in the office, a demand for them to return could be unreasonable, could amount to what we call a breach of trust and confidence. I think allowing home working as well to continue might amount to what we call under discrimination or a reasonable adjustment where an employee's condition amounts to a disability. So employers need to think carefully about dismissing that outright. At the same time, if the workplace has been made as safe as possible and there's a pressing need for that employee to attend, then they are advised to do their best to attend.
What about those strange people with whom I have very little in common who think that they just work better from home? I've even had friends in that situation say to me that they do go out at lunchtime and get their Pret sandwich, and that they are spending, albeit not necessarily in a city centre. What about the people who do just want to stay at home? Can they refuse?
Well, I think home working, like mask wearing, is proving to be a very divisive topic.
Absolutely.
Some people have really benefited. They like the flexibility. They like not commuting. It's more time with the family. They've found it peaceful. It's more conducive to work. Others have felt very lonely. Don't like that the lines between home and work have become blurred. They miss their colleagues. They're ready for a break in the monotony of the situation. So I think lots of employers are considering whether or not they might be able to permit home working in some capacity moving forward, because the employers have reported benefits too. There's no obligation for employers to terminate their leases and stay at home, but lots of them are. And I think it really comes down to the type of business. Not all companies want their staff working at home in the long term. Businesses have got objectives and plans. And whilst many people have coped very well during lockdown working at home and might prefer it, having staff remain at home might not be what's best for the business. All employees with 26 weeks continuous service have got the right to make a flexible working request. And that could include a request for home working. The flexible working requests are often made by those returning from family-related leave. But the reasons for requesting a variation to your working pattern or location don't have to be childcare related. It could be as simple as that you found yourself more productive at home, you feel the benefit of no commute, you work more productively, and you'd like to do that for a proportion of your week. It's then for the employer to decide whether they can accommodate that request. And there are 8 statutory reasons an employer can rely on when refusing a request if actually the request to stay at home, isn't going to suit their business needs.
You mentioned another reason there why working from home has been quite so divisive. For those with children, it's either been a godsend. Obviously, schools have been shut. They would have had no other options of what to do with young ones. For some people, that's obviously been a real challenge, juggling working with the childcare. Schools in England are, of course, planning to reopen from next week. We hope for everyone's sake that goes smoothly. But if it doesn't, and if parents do find themselves without childcare, is that enough to insist that they stay at home? I have heard people argue that would disproportionately affect women if they were forced to go back into the workplace, because we know that statistically the childcare does fall more heavily on women. Does discrimination law concur with that, Melanie?
Oh, I think that's potentially right. I mean, we know statistically that women do more childcare or have more childcare responsibilities than men, and that restrictions and specific issues with working times and locations might adversely affect them more. Many working parents have benefited from the ability to work from home during this time. And if they're able to continue to do so in the face of childcare issues, again, an employer should consider whether it's appropriate to press those staff to return. Of course, for many roles, employers will not be able to permit home working forever as we try and crawl out of this difficult period. For as long as the furlough scheme is available, that remains an option to assist those eligible working parents. But if an employee doesn't qualify for furlough and they're still reporting difficulties with childcare, they should obviously speak to their employer about that and try to reach an agreement. That could involve reducing their hours, taking some holiday, or even taking unpaid parental leave. I think until we see these issues sort of played out and see the way that these that these requests from men and women are treated, it's difficult to say whether or not it's, we're looking at discrimination necessarily, but certainly employers are advised to try and help those people who are suffering childcare difficulties, try and come to some sort of resolution.
The rest of the coronavirus latest news. Restrictions on mixing between different households in parts of Lancashire will be lifted next Wednesday. Public health officials have confirmed that the rules will be relaxed in Burnley and Hyndburn. The stricter measures will remain in place for at least another week in Preston and parts of Pendle, forbidding visits to other people's homes and gardens. The northwest of England had the highest coronavirus mortality rate for the month of July, but figures for all regions decreased since the previous month. There were 2.8 deaths involving COVID-19 per 100,000 people for the northwest, down from 9.2 in June, when it was also the region with the highest rate. According to the Office for National Statistics, the southwest of England had the lowest rate again, with 0.3 deaths per 100,000 people, down from 2.1 in June. In London, the rate was 1.2 for July, down from 3.1 in June. The figures take into account the age of the population and count all deaths where COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate. As always, if you'd like to read more on any of those stories, you'll find links to full write-ups in the show notes to this episode. And don't forget, if you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, and I can't think why not, now is the time to sign up. You can save over 50% on your Telegraph subscription until the end of August in our summer sale, making it just £1 a week. You'll find that offer at telegraph.co.uk/audio. I'll be back after the bank holiday weekend. If you find this podcast helpful, please do leave it a 5-star rating and a short review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps me know that I'm making audio that you enjoy listening to. If you'd like to get in touch, email me. The address is coronaviruspodcast@telegraph.co.uk. This is Coronavirus, the latest from The Telegraph. I'm Theodora Louloudis.